All right, guys, welcome to part two of the bench biomechanics lecture series. And similar to the squat lecture, we're kind of breaking it up the same way where part one, we're thinking about what happens during the bench. Obviously, the static components were the stuff that's not moving, the dynamic components, the things that need to move. Last lecture, we covered the statics of bench press, which are really more so the things that need to transfer force rather than things that shouldn't move at all, because unlike a squat, we don't need to have movement through the torso on a squat to transfer force to the bar. Whereas on a bench, if the static torso is a little bit fluid, if we can have some movement there, we can have better force transfer to the bar versus a squat where we want to be totally as rigid as possible. But that's last lecture. Today we're talking about the dynamics, like the actual things that need to move in order to press the bar. So what we covered last lecture, we ended up having a solid setup where our rib cage is tall, our leg drives on, our scaps are depressed, the slack is out of our serratus, we're ready to go, we're locked in, everything's taking weight that we want to take weight. So now what we need to do is figure out how we can get to the bottom of the bench and then lower the bar in a way that takes advantage of both our strengths and our leverages. And before we get into that, I want to reintroduce the planes of motion, because when we're talking about a joint like the shoulder that can operate in three dimensions, we need to clarify what which of those dimensions we are talking about if we're going to simplify it in a way that's easier to understand. So when we're talking about planes of motion, we have the sagittal plane, which is going to intersect your body and kind of like split it into side to side halves. We have the transverse plane, which is going to intersect your body horizontally and split you into like up and down parts. And we have the coronal plane or the frontal plane that's going to split you into forward and backward parts. And if we're thinking about motion in the sagittal plane, we're thinking about motion that runs along the plane that splits us in side to side halves. If we're thinking about motion that runs along the transverse plane, we're thinking about motion that runs along the plane of up and down halves. If we're thinking about motion that runs along the coronal or frontal plane, we're thinking about motion that runs kind of in that front to back half. And what we need to remember is, even though we're talking about motion along these planes, in reality, with the shoulder being a three-dimensional joint, it's almost never going to be strictly just transverse plane or strictly just sagittal plane or strictly just coronal plane. Like during a bench, we're going to have a little bit of all three. And I'm going to use examples at the extreme ends of the motions. I'm going to be talking about, like, if we were benching super flared strictly in transverse, this is what would be happening. If we're benching super tucked strictly sagittal, this is what would be happening. But in reality, we're going to be somewhere in between. And as we shift closer from one to the other, we're going to have more happening towards the one, less happening towards the other, but it will be a combination to some degree. And the degree to which we have that combination happening will depend on where the arm is going in space. And if we are closer to true sagittal or closer to true transverse or closer to true coronal, etc., etc., etc. And the last thing I want to make reference to here when we talk about rotation is the plane of the humerus, because similar to the hip, when we're talking about shoulder rotation, like, I'm not talking about moving that way. I'm talking about twisting along the humerus, and that can happen out here, that can happen up here, that can happen wherever. We're just worried about where the humerus is twisting and the roll along the axis of the humerus itself. So when we're talking about motion in the sagittal plane, we're talking about shoulder flexion, which is bringing the arm up, and shoulder extension, which is, I guess, bringing the arm down or back towards behind us if my chair wasn't in the way. So pure flexion extension is basically thinking like doing a dumbbell front raise is pure shoulder flexion. Pure shoulder extension is like doing a straight arm pull down or doing a pullover out of the top, pulling down towards the bottom. Shoulder abduction, adduction in the transverse plane. So transverse plane being the slicey up and downy, is going to be like doing a pure pec fly or doing a pure dumbbell fly reverse pec deck. It's going to be, just moving in this horizontal line like such. Now, we also have frontal plane abduction, adduction, which is going to be kind of like doing a delt fly or doing like a wide pull down, pulling in. And if we're talking about abduction, adduction, it's very important to clarify which plane we're talking about, because if I'm talking about shoulder adduction and we're starting at our side, if we're adducting from our side, that's going to be adducting, pulling away from midline in the frontal plane. If we're talking about being up here, like at the top of the bench, and we're talking about shoulder adduction, we're going to be pulling along that transverse plane going out to our sides, because from here, the only way that we can adduct, the only way we can pull from midline is in that transverse plane. From here, the only way we can adduct, the only way we can pull from midline is in that coronal plane. And like if we're down here, we can do a bit of both simultaneously. But again, we're going to use examples where we're kind of talking strictly in the planes to keep things simple. And the problem with reality is, depending on the degree of the frontal plane abduction, the bench will end up being a combination of both the shoulder extension to get down as well as the transverse abduction to get down. So if we are more flared, if we are more end up more frontally plane abducted, it's going to be more transverse plane abduction to lower. If we are more tucked, it's going to be more sagittal plane extension to lower the bar. So the degree of tuck and flare is going to change what is loaded and how it's loaded. But in reality, it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And again, like if we're closer to more tucked, it's going to act more like true sagittal plane, but there will be more of the transverse plane stuff going on than zero. Same thing for all the way out here. It's going to act more like true transverse plane, but there will be a little bit of contribution from the stuff that helps us in the sagittal. Does anyone have any questions about that? That wasn't too much word soup. We're good to go. I will move on. But basically, again, like the only thing we need to kind of talk about here is just thinking about like if the arm is out here, it's going to be different than the arm is tucked in here. And we're going to use these extreme examples of what is different from here to clarify and kind of give us an idea of what's going to happen in this middle range of space. So what does that, the abduction, adduction out to the side, what does that get us if we're moving in the frontal plane relative to a bench with the degrees of tuck? Well, we're going to get varying degrees of leverage from the sternal and clavicular heads of the pec, as well as the front deltoids. And when we're talking about pec major anatomy, we have, I guess, depending on the textbook you're looking at, it might break it up into clavicular, sternocostal, and then costal, because some of the sternal fibers really only end up on the rib cage, but the orientation of the fibers is what we're worried about here, because the fibers of the pec that run from the medial 2/3 of the clavicle to the humerus, they're going to be having more of that kind of like downward slope, whereas the fibers of the pec that are running from the sternum, running from the ribs, are going to have more of the across the pec slope. The front delta is going to have more of that downward slope. And when we're thinking about how a muscle is going to contribute to transmitting force to a bone through motion, a muscle can only shorten along its fiber pull. And if we want the motion to happen in a direction that occurs pretty much exactly along the direction of the fiber pull, that muscle is going to have a very high degree of leverage, and it's really going to want to work hard in that motion. Whereas if we have a muscle whose fibers do not align with the direction of fiber pull, it might get shorter through the range, but it's not going to be contributing a lot because its leverages, if it's not pulling in the right direction, it's not going to be helping us a ton with creating force in that direction. And when we're talking about the pec action with the humerus angle, if we are looking at the orientations of the fibers, we can see that the more tucked in we are, the more we're aligned with the direction of pull of the clavicular head. The more flared out we are, the more we're going to be in line with the direction of the pull of the sternocostal head. And I'm going to talk about the pec clavicular head separate from the front delt, because even if like the front delt looks like it's going to be similar leverage pull, because the front delt, it originates kind of further back on the clavicle and it inserts further on the side of the humerus, not kind of like the front of the humerus, its leverage changes are going to vary more with where we are in the actual bench stroke compared to the pec, which is more going to be varying with the angle of the humerus in that coronal plane AB deduction angle. So when we have less relative tuck, we are going to be more of that clavicular head. And again, I have my shitty Canva muscle pasted onto thing to kind of illustrate. These diagrams are nowhere near anatomically correct, so they're just here to help you guys visualize. So the pec does not just look like that. The pec the sternal head is also not just look like that, but we kind of visualize that as we have the arm more tucked, it's more in line with pulling with that clavicular head. As we have the arm more out, it's more in line with pulling with that sternocostal head. And with this, what we're kind of thinking about is if we are going to be more tucked in, it is going to be mostly clavicular head, but the sternal head is still going to be doing something to help us because it still is going to get shorter as we're pulling up the top. If we are flared, again, yes, it is going to be more direct leverage from the sternal head, but the clavicular head will still be getting shorter, so it still can contribute. And the big kind of caveat is that when we're more tucked, it's going to be a whoopsie daisies, didn't mean to click that. It's going to be a hell of a lot of clavicular head here and not a ton of sternal head when we're more tucked. When we're more flared, it's going to be a shit ton of sternal head, but the clavicular head is still going to be doing a decent amount of work. So wider is going to be more total pec. And that's why, again, like you see people saying bench wide for more total pec. And little sidebar here on the sternal head's role when we are tucked in. Mechanically, this is what I think contributed to my pec ripping off. And what I want to remind you guys, if you watch the classroom section on muscle strains tears, you'll remember that it's not so much absolute load that causes a muscle to tear. It is whether or not we experience loading that is unfamiliar to the muscle that causes a reflexive contraction, and then that reflexive overcontraction is what causes the muscle to actually rip off and explode. Because like in a perfect world, if we have the task that we're prepared for, if we're coordinated in the motion, we would just miss the weight and not have it tear off because our reflexes would take over positively and cause the thing to just shut down and inhibit so we don't have anything nasty happening. And if we're looking at the fiber orientation of the sternal head, it's not going to do a lot of, like in this position, it's not going to be able to do a lot of really anything for pushing the bar. It's going to shorten and contribute a little bit to that shoulder flexion to contribute to the clavicular head. But what I'm really thinking about what's going on in this position is in relation to that plane of the humerus, because if this gets short, the most direct thing it's going to do, it's going to be an internal rotator in this position, right? It's going to be trying to spin that humerus inwards as it rolls across, as it pulls kind of like that. And like that role as an internal rotator in this position is not a bad thing on its own. But if you're someone like me that was benching relatively wide at the time, I remember on this rep, this is the rep where I tore it on, so you actually see the bottom position before, like, this is probably right as things were starting to come apart. But during this press, I remember like unracking and kind of feeling like I had to be super like tucked in to find stability because like my upper back was struggling out here. So I just kind of clonked in here to try to find some stability. And I remember like as I was lowering the bar, I just like because I was tucked and wide, I remember just like feeling like I was getting cranked and cranked and cranked more to this chicken wing position. And then it was like as soon as I went to press out of that chicken wing, it's like the sternal head just freaked out, tried to rotate through to kind of gain leverage. And I think it was that rotation lengthening with the poor leverage position. I think that is what contributed more to the thing ripping off than the amount of weight I had on the bar. But the amount of weight I had on the bar led to that lack of stability, which then contributed to the thing ripping off. So that's a little bit of like the sidebar and pec tears. I think like the take home message here is a lot of the sternal pec tears that I have seen have been under similar circumstances, meaning that it's usually a guy that is wider, that ends up overtucked, that ends up chicken wing. Like I know Jordan Wong when he did hit, he had a bunch of shoulder stuff going on that it was causing him to kind of be all ended up in here, which is going to lead to that both getting longer as the humerus goes, but also getting longer as the rotation's happening. And then we can have some less than ideal circumstances in terms of pec leverage going on. So, with that aside, what about the front delt? And like I mentioned earlier, it looks like it should be leveraged similarly to the clavicular head of the pec because like it's more straight down, even like you'd almost think that it would be more favorable to that shoulder flexion out of the bottom. But there's a little bit of a problem is like with the origin point on the lateral clavicle kind of being behind where the clavicular head of the pec is, with its origin kind of being on a I don't know, a shitty part of the humerus for lack of better terms, it is going to contribute to shoulder flexion in the tucked position, but in the very bottom, the clavicular head of the pec is going to have a shit ton more leverage. And in the bottom here, the front delt with where it's orientated, its best leveraged action is actually going to be contributing to abduction in the scapular plane, or like along the plane of the scapula. So it's what the front delt, if it's only going to be front delt and we're in this position, it's going to want us to kind of kick out upwards into the side a little bit, which makes sense, as if we are going to be wider out, something very neat happens, but I got mixed in my words, so I'm going to backtrack. If we're staying tucked as we're pressing through, we don't have a ton of leverage front delt here, but the higher we get, the more relative leverage the front delt gains. And once we kind of approach 80, 90, if we're going overhead press, even more so, but once we're approaching the top end of bench, it becomes more and more front delt leverage, less and less clavicular pec leverage, which explains why if someone that is tucked and they get stuck mid-range and they have to flare to find leverage, that's usually going to be front delt weakness, and that's where I'd want to put in overhead press. Now, going back to if we're trying to flare out of the bottom because we don't have clavicular pec, well, a big reason that's happening is that if we think about the front delt at the bottom of bench press, if we are flared and out here, if we have the humerus behind the rib cage, the front delt's actually more favorable in leverage at the very bottom wide than the sternal head of the pec, just because of how it kind of lays over the humerus and wraps and detaches really low down here. It's got a shit ton of ability to kind of drive us out of that bottom, 5-10 degrees of the press. And if we are someone that has like front delt and sternal head of the pec the strong, the clavicular head of the pec isn't, the front delt is gonna, if we're starting here and the clavicular head of the pec isn't strong, the front delt's gonna want to guide us out there so we can use the front delt and sternal pec better to have things, happen positively for us. So where that flare point happens is going to kind of tell us what is going on. If we're flaring, if we have to flare through the mid range, that tells us that our front delta is probably missing to carry us to the top. If we're flaring out of the very bottom, we can hypothesize that our front delt and sternal pec are strong to get things going. And going back to the front delt through the press, it is going to steadily gain leverage over that clavicular head of the pec until at the top it's going to be a shit ton of front delt, not a ton of clavicular pec. And if we are someone who is benching with a tuck and don't have that strong front delt, you'll need to flare to get past that mid-range sticking point. And like I posted on Instagram the other day, the bench where he was kind of getting here and he kind of got stuck, and he just flared, then kind of gained momentum back to the top. Like that is textbook front delt not doing its job, because if his front delt was strong, it would just carry through from his strong clavicular pec all the way to lockout, and he wouldn't need to have that abrupt out in order to finish. Now, if we're pressing with flare, the front delt is going to have a ton of leverage in the very bottom. It starts out with better leverage in the sternal pec, but as we get closer to the top, the bigger and the much bigger muscle, the sternal pec, is going to steadily gain leverage to the point where, like, even through the mid range, the front delt might have, numbers wise, better leverage positioning. The sternal head of the pec being much bigger, once we're out of the very bottom, the sternal head of the pec is going to take over, and it's going to end up being a lot of sternal head of the pec carrying the humerus through to the top. But this right here is why, if someone is the flared bencher, because their front delt is getting loaded so much in that lengthened position, that front delt is going to get a shit ton of work. And that's why, like, there are some people who, in their experience, they don't need to really train front delts, and they are super duper front delted, because they are someone who benches with a lot of flare. Their front delt ends up getting a ton of work on bench press, and they end up, not needing to really train it because it is so developed from that bottom end with their flared position. Whereas if you have someone like me whose shoulder history, I've never really liked to flare benching. I've always wanted to bench with a bigger tuck because of my shoulders. It becomes pretty much just clavicular head of the pack in the bottom, and because I, didn't wasn't really training my front delts, again because I was stupid at the time and didn't have great shoulders. I had always a clavicular pec flare, and I was someone who ended up having, I have still to this day very weak front delts, even though they are getting better and better and better. But the only reason they're getting better is because I'm starting to do more overhead work. I'm starting to do more front raises in order to bring those guys up. And if we're thinking about identifying weak points between the clavicular pack, the sternal pack, and the front delt, a clavicular pack weak point is going to be avoidance of the tuck position. If you're someone who has to bench super flared, if you start carrying the bar lower, you feel like you're going to die. That's probably indicating the clavicular pack might need a little bit of bringing up, but it's going to look like a hard flare regardless of grip. And if someone is like even close grip, if they have to flare in their close grip, that can work really well if the triceps are super strong to support it. And if we do have clavicular pec weakness, I'm not saying that we want to be someone that tucks more, because if a flared bench is working for you, awesome. But if we can bring up clavicular pec, we might be able to do better with that flare. So I'd be thinking about doing some secondary work that's, a tucked neutral grip, like on a Swiss bar or on a machine, that will touch it a shit ton, as would a close grip incline due to the leverage situation. So those could be good things to train as a accessory if you are someone that does need to bench with a ton of flare to give you a little bit more availability. Now, if we have sternal pec weakness, it is going to be avoidance of the flared position. And that can kind of happen in two different directions depending on what is stronger. If you are like me, that could be over tucking and kind of bringing it into that chicken wing to load clavicular pec. Or if you guys remember, Bradley posted his bench video a couple months ago when we were sorting out a shoulder. He was dumping into the shoulder and having that really big internal dump. Now, knowing what we know about front delt leverages, if we are dumping in this direction, that's going to be giving the front delt better leverage and kind of skating away from the pec so we can front delt out of the bottom. And bringing it up is going to be finding a way to train wider grip without allowing yourself to dump down. So if we can run a wider grip press where we are flaring, but we're not dumping and we're kind of controlling with the upper back, we can force that sternal head of the pec to accept loading. And if we get better at that, we should be able to get it to do more and more and more. And dumbbells can be a lot easier to accomplish this with than a barbell, because the barbell having, being rigid between the hands, we can kind of use it to help control dump. Whereas a dumbbell, if you dump the dumbbell, you're going to die. So it kind of forces you to do it right. Machine presses can be great here, as can dumbbell flies to bring that up. And if we have front delt weakness, that's going to look like, in most cases, it's going to be someone who is relatively tucked and they stall at midpoint, then need to flare in order to find more sternal pec and triceps. And it's basically going to be like someone who is tucked on their bench until they're not. And if someone is strong in the sternal pec, if someone is strong in the triceps, they're going to be able to finish through the movement. If someone is not strong in the sternal pec, not strong in the triceps, it's just going to look like they're in, they're in, they're in. They just stall, they flare, they flare, they flare, and then they die because they're trying to search for leverages, but they don't actually have the strength in order to finish the press up. And the best way to bring this up, in my opinion, is going to be overhead press work. And I got into an argument in the Instagram comments the other day about someone talking about how a pin press would be more specific to this weak point than overhead press, because pin press is in the exact same plane as a bench. But the problem with running the exact same plane of motion, if it is a weak point that is very leverage dependent, like front delt, is that if we're running a pin press to try to correct front delt weakness, we're going to have the tendency to just flare away from the front delt and flare away from the front delt. So we're not really going to be directly touching it. And if it is going to be heavy enough to be productive, it's going to be really, really, really freaking tough to keep it in the front delt. Whereas if we're just doing an overhead press, we're going to be directly touching that front delt over and over and over again. And we can't really cheat away from it. So it's going to force us to use the thing. So even though an overhead press is a different plane of motion, it's going to better touch the front delt. And if we are someone who is here, gets stuck, and we need front delt to help us carry through, the overhead press is going to be a much better option than a pin in order to get things going. And in addition, Missy's asking, can front delt weakness be confused with tricep weakness when finishing the press? And I would say a lot of times yes, because it is going to look like a similar range of motion, but I think how it ends up looking is going to change on how the miss happens or how the slowdown happens. Now, if someone does have strong triceps, the front delt is going to look like it's going to be slow, slow, slow. They flare, and then they're able to chug through because the triceps can help with that bar spread to push through. But if it is someone who is, if they're tucked in, tricep weakness is kind of going to look like they're going to get here, and then the bar can't stay over the elbow, they can't extend, so they're going to try to flare, and it ends up kind of like drifting more like as a splat over the face versus someone who is able to spread into it and get it through. So I think it's going to be a matter of like, does the bar overdrift over the face? Then I'm going to be thinking more triceps at the top end. Can they just not finish? And thinking more triceps at the top end. But if it is like a flare and then accelerate through to finish, then we're going to be looking more at the front delt. Which brings us to, what about the triceps? Well, the elbow needs to extend, right? So we need to get the elbow locked in order to complete a bench press, and the triceps' primary job is just that. It's going to be locking the elbow. But depending on where the humerus is, the tricep can help assist with bench in two different ways. And again, we're going to use the extreme tuck example as well as the extreme flared example to illustrate this, because the more elbow band we have, whether we're tucked or flared. So if we're tucked and we have a lot of elbow band, we're ultra close, we're going to have a lot of tricep contribution. If we're flared, if we're tucked, a lot of elbow band, the bar is way behind the elbow, we're going to again have a lot of tricep contribution. But how the tricep is going to contribute in these situations is going to be a little bit different. And if you, I'll, I won't have the spoiler alert happen too soon, but if we're someone who is tricepy and tuck, again, the more elbow bend, the more the triceps can contribute. And with what is going on here, what we want to think about is the relative leverages the bar is exerting on the shoulder and the elbow in these two positions. Because, throw back to the first lecture, if we're thinking about that leverage that the bar is putting on the body, we need to think about the distance from the bar to the joint, not just in a straight line as close as possible, but perpendicular to the line of gravity. Because if we're thinking about causing rotation about an axis, the only distance that matters is the distance perpendicular to the force. Because if, again, like if I have my finger here and I'm trying to bend my finger and I'm pushing at an angle, like all of that angled force isn't moving the finger, but if I'm pushing straight down, it is moving the finger. So we're worried about the perpendicular, not the just absolute distance to the shoulder from the bar. And what we see here is, if we do have that bar way behind the elbows, we have a much smaller distance from the shoulder to the bar compared to if we are stacked over top. Now, the trade off to that is we have a much greater distance from the bar to the elbow. So that's going to be the triceps taking the load. But if the triceps take the load versus, zero load here, we're gaining back leverage at the shoulder. So if we are someone who, you know, their pecs are totally shitter, they're totally like they don't have a ton of pec, period. What I'm going to be thinking about is, okay, if they were to get stronger triceps and they don't have any pecs at all, they can kind of almost JM their bench and make the levers on the shoulder very friendly, so they don't need to have a ton of drive through. Now, if we're someone with a large degree of elbow flare, elbow bend and the leverages aren't the only thing that we are looking at. Because if we're doing like, the flared one ultra wide, one ultra close, the humeral angle, the position is going to be relatively similar in both, but there's a lot of different stuff going. Now, if we do kind of the same leverage analysis with the wider grip, if we're ultra wide and flared, we have a shit ton of leverage between the bar and the shoulder. And if we're looking at the leverage that the bar places on the elbow, well, the bar's leverage on the elbow is actually going to be trying to, if we're out here, it's going to be trying to open the elbow up. The bar wants to load into the biceps. And if we were trying to, do like a dumbbell fly in this position, a dumbbell fly ends up being bicep work because the dumbbell fly is trying to open that bicep up, right? But because we are lifting a barbell here, not a dumbbell, something neat happens with Newton's third law, because we have the bars trying to open up the elbow on one side, the bars also trying to open up the elbow on the other side, the bar being a static in the context of bench. Like, we're not going to actually spread the bar apart, but that bar spreading against itself is going to kind of cancel out the elbow opening. And if we were just going to be like benching with, zero elbow intent, zero elbow action, we're just making the bench like just arms off, just there to hang out, hold the bar, then the bar is going to kind of cancel out from both sides. So we're going to be kind of a net neutral on the elbow in this position overall. Now, if we aren't just relaxing and having our elbow doing absolutely nothing, some neat stuff can happen. So if we were actually going to contract the bicep and try to squeeze the bar together, well, the bicep's going to try to close that elbow joint, right? And the bar being static, it's not going to allow that elbow joint really to close, but it is going to be trying to push that elbow downwards, which is going to actually add more force to the pec, which is why if a bodybuilder's like, hey, you should squeeze the bar together to get more pec, like that's probably not the worst idea in the context of growing pec, but that might be the worst idea in the context of trying to push the weight up because you're applying a force that is strong in the opposite direction of where we want the bar to go. But if we are going to be spreading the bar apart, if the triceps are contracting, that tricep contraction using the hand as a lever, it's going to push the elbow through and assist the pec and take weight off of the pec. It's going to make the pec's job a lot easier because we're having not just the humerus being pulled across by the pec, it's being pushed across by the triceps up to the top. And the way I like to think about this is kind of making the bow and arrow analogy where if where the bar is the top of the bow, if the shoulder is the bottom of the bow, the triceps is like the bow string that's loaded into, the elbow is the arrow, and the triceps is going to be pushing that arrow, pushing that elbow through as we go up to lockout. And if we're applying this same concept to the narrow grip and spread versus the wide grip and spread, we see that if we're narrow, we end up having a lot more relative leverage in the tricep, a lot more potential for the tricep to do work, a lot less relative leverage on the pec and shoulder in this extreme case than if we were wide. So if we're here, we can have the triceps help a shit ton with what the pecs and shoulders are doing. And we can have the triceps also help leverage wise. We can also have them helping a ton in terms of being able to push through. So if someone has insanely strong triceps, decent pecs and shoulders, a closer grip and a flare can be a really, really, really good strategy to bench. And I think like this is where the whole triceps are important for raw benching and why I prioritize triceps so much. This is kind of where it comes into play because the stronger the triceps are, the better we can do with our pecs and shoulders and the more kind of freedom we have and the less stress we have, especially with someone like myself who has had a lot of shoulder injury history. Like the better I get my triceps to work, the better they do. And even if I'm not at whoopsie daisies, even if I'm not at like this point, like James Strickland is one of the better examples of this style of benching. It's not as extreme as the diagram, obviously, but he is relatively narrow. And as he goes, you can see his elbows end up outside of the hands. That becomes a shit ton of triceps, and he's just able to tricep shove it through. And you can even tell, like in the bottom, he's kind of dumping away from the pec. So it's not a ton of pec here. It's just mostly front delts to kind of support the bottom, triceps to drive through the top. And for someone who is that strong on the elbows, it works really, really, really freaking well. But you need to be really freaking strong on the elbows in order to make it happen. And Julius is another example, similar style. Like actually, a lot of Josh Bryant's guys with how much tricep work he does do end up benching in this fashion. But again, it's if we're looking at it, he's relatively narrow. His elbows end up outside of the bar of the hand grip, and he's just tricepping it through to the top. So, like that's how it looks like if you have like otherworldly strong triceps. Not everyone has otherworldly strong triceps, so not everyone can be that strong with that close grip. But the stronger triceps we have, the better we can help out with the shoulders. So no matter what, strong triceps aren't going to hurt you. And if we have strong triceps in addition to strong pecs, you're going to be able to do some pretty cool stuff with your bench. Now, in terms of shoulder rotation, I kind of talked about this in the office hours earlier this week, but I saw this infographic on Instagram that, so many people were all excited about talking about shoulder rotation in relation to grip width, talking about how, like, if we're suicide grip, we're going to be more externally rotated. If we're kind of a neutral grip, we're going to be relatively neutral rotation. If we're bulldog, we're going to be more biased towards internal rotation. And at the top of the bench, absolutely true in the context of like where the shoulder is statically. But what matters more than the static positioning of the shoulder is how the shoulder has to roll in order to get to the bottom of your bench. And What matters more there is going to be your degree of tuck or flare in relation to your grip width. Because if you are someone who is starting at the top with a neutral close grip, but you really tuck the shit out of it, you're going to be biased more to humerus external rotation because the humerus has to roll outwards in order to get to the bottom if we are tucking inside of our grip. On the opposite side, if we're flaring outside of our grip, the humerus is going to need to roll internally as we get to the bottom. So it's not going to be as simple as, is your grip externally rotated, is your grip internally rotated? It's a matter of where your arm is going in space. Because like even if we went with the example of like the extreme example of reverse grip, if I reverse grip and hella flare, I'm going to be very uncomfortable, but I'll be needing more shoulder IR. If I reverse grip and hella tuck, obviously that is going to be more ER. But what matters is more of the hand position in relation to the elbow position from the top to the bottom. That's going to tell us how the shoulder needs to roll to get there. And if we're having someone that is more internally rotated versus externally rotated on a closer grip, the more internally rotated we are on the bottom, the more elbow flare we're having happen as we lower on the close grip. It's going to be more front delt and more sternal pec, and the triceps are going to be contributing through both that spread and leverage, like the Julius bench, like the James Strickland bench. If we are going to be more externally rotated close grip, we're really having a big tuck. It's going to be more clavicular pec, but the triceps are going to be contributing leverage only until we flare to spread. And this is going to be okay for strong triceps in the absence of strong sternal pec. So, like if you're me at Shell Shock, where I ripped my pec off, like I ended up there because my sternal pec wasn't ready for it. But that's, if I had more sternal pec, I could have not needed to go to that spot and I would have had a better chance at having a sternal pec after the fact. But bottom line here is that if we are more externally rotated, it's going to be better for clavicular pec with the close grip. If we're more internally rotated, it's going to be better for front delt and sternal pec. And kind of like where you end up going is going to tell us what we probably should be aiming for. Now, with the wider grip, no matter if we are tucked or flared, the triceps are going to be able to contribute through spread because if we're wider, we have more ability to spread against the bar, more leverage to spread against the bar. But the same thing is going to be happening in regards to the front delt and sternal pec because if we're more out, more internally rotated, we're going to have more front delt, more sternal pec in the bottom. If we're more tucked, we're going to have more clavicular pec. And this is again, like this is where it gets really sketchy in the sternal pec. If you are someone who is wide and trying to load it, but then trying to avoid it at the same time, like this is where, it can go bad news bears very, very, very quickly. Now, where the actual grip set comes in is if I'm thinking about kind of like strategizing around the amount of dynamic rotation that is happening as we're lowering the bar, as we're pressing the bar. So this is kind of why the false grip, like why it feels so good off my pack, is because with where my humerus wants to end up, my humerus wants to end up, if I were neutral, in a relatively externally rotated position. But if I'm starting relatively externally rotated with the false grip, I don't have any dynamic rotation, or I have much less dynamic rotation happening because where my humerus is at the top is just where it's going to be at the bottom. Versus as if I were to bulldog and then end up with the same humeral position, that would be a ton of dynamic rotation as I'm lowering. Whereas going with the suicide grip, I can just straight up lower the bar and go where I want it to go. Now, on the other side, if we're someone who, doesn't want to externally rotate, starting with relative IR, finish with in bulldog, finishing with relative IR, they can kind of just drive straight through with the pec without a ton of rotation needing to happen. And again, like if I were to suicide grip and try to flare, that would be a ton of dynamic IR happening in order to get to the bottom. But if I just switch to the bulldog, it's just kind of going in and out straight through without needing that roll to occur as the press is happening, as the eccentric is happening. So the big take home point from this, though, is that is rotation a bad thing? Absolutely not, because no matter how we're setting our grip up, some rotation at the shoulder will be required. And kind of what matters more and what we need to strategize around is our rotational availability and our control of the rotation. And the big thing to remember is that with the shoulder being a three-dimensional ball and socket joint, pretty much everything is going to have some rotational role. And if we're looking at the things that actually move the bar, the pecs, the front delts, even the lats contribution, they're all going to be internal rotators. So if we allow some degree of IR through the press, that's going to let the front delt work more efficiently because we're going to be letting the humerus go where the humerus wants to go. And If we don't have access, we may want to modify away from, the amount of rotation required. But if we do, I'm totally fine with it as long as we're pressing in a way that looks efficient for our leverages. Which brings up the question, where should we aim? And what I'm thinking about in terms of like deciding how much tuck, grip width, how much flare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is where does your bench want to go as you press? Because again, similar to the squat, eccentrically, because we're so much stronger eccentrically, it takes so much less contraction to control an eccentric. We can kind of just like put the eccentric where we psychologically want to go. But the concentric, because the concentric requires way more actual contraction to do the thing and requires way more actual strength to do the thing, the concentric is going to tell us where the bench wants to go itself. So if we're someone who is lowering the bar a certain way, but it goes way different on the concentric, it's going to tell us, hey, maybe we should think about changing this way, that way, or the other. So if you are someone who is stalling at that flare point, it might be as simple as, hey, maybe we need to flare sooner to catch more pecs earlier so that front delt isn't quite as exposed. Because in this situation here, like I'm searching for sternal pec and missing badly because I also don't have the sternal pec on the left side yet to support it. But I'm searching for sternal pec because I'm out of front delt, because I don't have sternal pec to support at this height. I was unable to finish. So in like this style of miss, obviously I'd want to be stronger to push through. But I could maybe flare earlier, find pec sooner, have better tricep spread sooner, and not be as exposed and lose that momentum. On the other side of things, which is the strategy that I'm more going for because my sternal pec is still a little bit wonky, is I'm trying to build the shit out of my front delts so that I don't need to flare. So it's like, okay, it might be positioning. We could influence positioning to better the strength, but if the positioning isn't there, we can bring up the strength so that we don't need to go with positioning. Now, if you're someone who is flaring out of the bottom, if you're way tucked in, and you just need to get going. It might be as simple as finding a way to lower the bar with more flare so you can use the levers that you want to go to. And if you're searching for sternal pec because you don't have the triceps to keep the bar behind the elbows, we might want to bring up the triceps. But again, I think the simpler option in this case would be just to widen the grip, have a little bit more flare so that you can use more sternal pec, and then think about bringing the triceps up over time to better support that. And if you are someone who, you know, is down here and they flare and then they just die and their pecs hurt and their shoulders hurt and everything sucks, then I might be thinking like, okay, we need to more directly touch triceps. And I'd probably be thinking a JM for someone who is tucked in and then needs to flare. If you're someone who is, having that shoulder roll into the front delts, if you're already wide-ish and you're rolling out more, do we have room to go wider? Like, could we just, go, a little bit wider to better touch the front delt and the bottom so we don't need to roll to get there and we can be more efficient? If you're someone who isn't wide and you're rolling, then again, like maybe we just need to again widen out, and that could be the simplest answer. But the less simple answer is going to be to bring up sternal pec to support the bottom end position so we don't need to roll in the first place. So it's not going to be kind of like, it's never this kind of cut and dry as like what's the best option. It's going to be a matter of what options do we have in relation to what the individual is dealing with. And again, like if it is looking like we're just totally shittered out of leverage, I might want to change the leverage. If it's looking like we're doing the best leverage wise that we can, we might want to bring up strength. And in the context of tricep weakness at the top, where again, like where we're pressing, and the elbows can't lock, and the bar just kind of like bleh, and falls, and you just kind of splat kind of into the rack, into the J hooks or whatever. Like it's going to be kind of hard to fix that leverage wise, because like once we're up here, like we can't really do a whole lot of anything to make it easier on the triceps to get those elbows through. All we can really think about doing is getting the triceps stronger in the context of that range of motion. And my big things for that are going to be Tate presses and high boards with kind of an intent on putting the elbows where they get stuck on that high board press. So that is what I got for this lecture, guys. Let me know if you have any questions, or if anything was confusing along the way, or if you have any specific questions to weak points, etc., etc. Nothing's popping up. Oh, Michael's here.
I've got one about stuff from last week.
Yep.
So I have a problem with my butt lifting up on bench press, but I push horizontally, um, and my butt isn't necessarily like lifting up in space. It's mainly I just lose the pelvic tilt. Would you make a differentiation between those two things? And like, is there a different fix for that, or is it the same issue?
So when you say like you're losing the pelvic tilt, like you end up just kind of like flattening up and the butt kind of everything kind of rolls. Neat. So what I might be thinking is I might be going more towards trying to improve your ability to like access pure hip extensions. Like if you're I suspect that we're kind of lacking a little bit of hip extension there that's kind of causing that roll to happen. So it's like my strategy for fixing it, where I'm trying to teach guys to learn how to drive through that hip extended position so they're driving the right direction. I might shift the intent there a little bit from pure just trying to focus on the drive direction because you already are driving the right way to more trying to get more length at hip extended position so we can kind of crank into that so we can kind of stay tucked in better when we do create the drive. Does that make sense? So like on a Bulgarian split squat, if you're using a Bulgarian split squat to kind of prime the bench, we'd be thinking like obviously we want to be driving to the back leg, but I'd be prioritizing squeezing the shit out of the back glute and shoving that hip forward so we can get better at driving with that extended position with the pelvis where we want it to be.
All right, thank you.
And Eisen's asking in the chat, how do I bring up my clavicular pec strength? And that's going to be like trying to basically leverage wise target where it is going to be exposed. So that's like we talked about in the lecture, like if we are going to be neutral grip and tucked in, this is going to make it almost entirely clavicular pec, especially if we, go with the American camber bar and get more range, or especially if we're on a machine that lets us push through or dumbbells with a neutral grip that let us push through. That's going to be so much clavicular pec. Another thing that can be a decent option is going to be a incline close grip as well with a tuck. That can be good as well if you don't have a neutral grip bar or don't have access to dumbbells, or you could just ride a straight up close grip tuck bench as well. And the reason I like the neutral is over incline or over regular close grip is that the neutral grip makes it very difficult to revert to the flare because our grip is neutral. We can't really twist out of it. So it kind of forces us to stay with that elbows nice and in without a ton of rotation. So it ends up just being that clavicular pec leverage point to get the sucker going. So it's kind of just a matter of like thinking about like, okay, where is this muscle well leveraged? Let's put the range of motion where that muscle is well leveraged and then make ourselves stay there. And then if we have to stay there, we're gonna have to make the muscle work. And I think like that's kind of like one of the things where lats get confused in the bench press because if we're looking at lat leverage in regards to humeral action, like everyone kind of wants to talk about how, oh, the lats can't move the bar because like the lats best leveraged action is going to be, again, it's a humeral adductor. Like it wants to pull the humerus towards midline. But if we're thinking about where the humerus is on a press, like if the humerus is up here, we can get closer to like the lat's going to get shorter from there to there. If the lat shortens, the lat's going to be contributing to that action. It's not going to be primary. It's going to be wanting to pull down there. But with co-contraction, with the delts, with the pecs, with everything, the lat gets shorter. The lat is going to help pull that elbow in. In the bottom of the bench, if we have elbow behind rib cage, the lat's leverages here aren't great, but if the lat gets shorter, it's going to pull that elbow towards midline and it can help boost the set at the bottom. So it's kind of like one of those things where I would never train bench for lats, but like that's kind of how the lats can help us. And that's kind of like the opposite example of trying to make it well leveraged for a movement because the lats leverage on bench are terrible, but that doesn't mean that it can't contribute. To touch on that guy a little bit. Anything else you guys want to touch on? Yeah, go for it, dude.
So should people just get really good at that style of bench press, or would you encourage people to get good at multiple? Like, should they be able to go super flared, super tucked, lots of elbow bend, all of the above?
Oh, that's sick question. Actually, I'm glad you asked that because I should have talked about this a little bit. But kind of my take is that if we're strong in a place, we want to prioritize that strength. Like we want to make like if you are a very pec bencher already, and your triceps are weak, but your bench is strong, I wouldn't be like, we need to scrap all pec training to catch the triceps up. I'd be like, hell yeah, let's just keep digging the pecs, keep making that really, really good out here. Because if it's good out there, we want to just keep making what's strong better. But what I also want to make sure is happening in terms of a wear and tear perspective, for lack of better, kind of hate the words wear and tear, but if we're thinking about wear and tear in a evidence based fashion, wear and tear is less about like, are we repeating a pattern, and more about, do we have availability for other patterns? Because if we are just going this and this is the only humorous motion we're doing, we're going to eventually lose ability to go here. And the more that we don't go here, the more locked into here we'll get. And then if we ever do deviate, the higher the level of risk becomes to that deviation. So, from a perspective of like, if you are someone who needs to bench ultra close, like a lot of my shoulders getting healthier is finding ways that I can bench flared without having things go sideways. A lot of like, if I have someone who is ultra flared and they have no shoulder extension, like Missy, we had to start doing some dips. Like that's gonna be, I don't think the dip is gonna really directly drive the bench, but it's gonna let the shoulder feel better, let the shoulder work better, which should help the bench down the road. So it's gonna be less of like a, we want to touch at other patterns enough that we don't lose it, but we also want to make sure that we're not doing it at the expense of prioritizing strength. And like in an off season, we might want to go a little bit more towards different patterns, different areas, different leverage points. But in a meet prep, we want to make sure that the strong shit is strong, and then we have work to support it. And then in terms of like weak point strengthening, again, like if you're a pec bencher and your triceps are lagging behind the pecs, it's like, again, we want to place priority on the pecs, we want the pecs to go, but then it's easy to just do enough tricep work on top of that to help the triceps get better. So it's like, I'd be order priorities, I'd be prioritizing strength first, I'd be prioritizing a weak point that can help the strength, and then I'd be prioritizing like weird position third or fourth, just to kind of have the sake of shoulder health and shoulder integrity long term. Did that answer that well?
Yeah, that's good.
Beauty. Alrighty. And if you have more, like feel free to just keep going, Michael. Happy to hang out. But if not, I'll probably shut this guy down here. Sick. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you so much. And again, like feel free to shoot me a message or comment when I post it if you have anything that you need clarification on. And have a great rest of your day.